I first want to thank everyone who's spoken before me. The contributions have been wonderful from all three contributors. Why did I write my book? Because it is about time that the Zionist version of the Holocaust was challenged. We have had a comprehensive rewriting of the history of the Holocaust by the Zionists. And it's a rewriting which has eliminated, for example, the anti-Zionist Jewish resistance. You wouldn't know it, but during the fight of the Warsaw Ghetto resistance beforehand, the Zionist parties in Palestine commanded the Zionists who did fight, and many Zionists did, the Zionist youth in the ghetto, not to fight, but to leave for Palestine where the real fight was happening. But of course, unless you go to very select academic books, you would never hear about this. The second thing is we all hear that 6 million Jews died in the Holocaust. What we often don't hear is that nearly 4 million Jews survived the Holocaust. Many of them, about 1.5 million, according to Raoul Hilberg, survived because they escaped to the Soviet Union, to Russia. But I want to say this about it, that if non-Jews had behaved towards the Jews of Nazi-occupied Europe, like the Israelis today behave towards the Palestinians, then it wouldn't have been 6 million, but it would have been 7 or possibly even 8 million Jews who died. And that is a mark of the attitude and the behavior of ordinary Israelis today, that apart from a tiny minority, the vast majority are complicit in all the horrors of the occupation. And for example, we've seen a massive demonstration, in fact, demonstrations in Tel Aviv against the new government and the threat, as they call it, to Jewish democracy. But what you don't hear is that Palestinian flags and Israelis who carry Palestinian flags and call for the end to the occupation have been attacked by the majority of demonstrators. In other words, this is an internal Zionist affair, an internal Israeli Jewish affair. You also don't hear that during the Holocaust, there was one country in Europe where the number of Jews actually increased, and from which not one single Jewish person was deported to the extermination camps. And do you know which country that is? It is Albania, a Muslim country in the middle of Christian Europe. And when I hear about the Judeo-Christian heritage, which is such a favorite theme of the neoconservatives and the imperialists, I say, what nonsense. It was Christian Europe which persecuted the Jews. And in fact, it was the Christian nationalist regimes in Europe, Croatia, Slovakia, from where the first deportations took place, Hungary and Romania, above all, which exterminated their Jews. And in fact, the persecution in Romania was so bad that even the Nazis blanched. Hans Frank, the Governor General of Poland, commented that the Nazis believed in surgery, not butchery. You also don't hear that the collaborationist Judenrat, the Jewish councils, which helped, in fact, they organized the roundup of Jews and they winkled Jews out of their hiding places. Over 2/3 of them consisted of the Zionist leadership in those ghettos. All of this, as I say, has been rewritten out of history. And one of my favorite Jewish writers, maybe the greatest political philosopher and scientist of the last century, Hannah Arendt, she wrote a book, Eichmann in Jerusalem, after the Eichmann trial, and she was demonized. She was attacked as a Holocaust denier, even, despite the fact that she was a refugee from Nazi Germany and she barely escaped from an internment camp in France. And what angered them above all was a statement in Eichmann in Jerusalem that wherever Jews lived, and I'm quoting exactly, wherever Jews lived, there were recognized Jewish leaders. And this leadership, almost without exception, cooperated in one way or another, for one reason or another, with the Nazis. The whole truth was that if the Jewish people had really been unorganized and leaderless, there would have been chaos and plenty of misery, but the total number of victims would hardly have been between 4.5 and 6 million. This provoked an outcry, of course, from Zionist historians who have defended the Judenrat because the Judenrat was made up primarily of Zionists. But as Dieter Wisliceny, one of Eichmann's main adjutants, explained, our system is to exterminate the Jews through the Jews. We concentrate the Jews in the ghettos through Jews. We deport the Jews by the Jews, and we gas the Jews by the Jews. Well, I'm not quite sure the latter is true, but it's absolutely true that the Judenrat was one of the main instruments in concentrating and in deporting the Jews themselves. And therefore I have to ask, can there be anything more despicable than the way Israel exploits the murder of 6 million by using the death of Europe's Jews, most of whom did not support Zionism? And in Poland, in the last free elections in 1938 in Warsaw, out of 20 Jewish council seats, 17 were won by the anti-Zionist Jewish Bund. Just one was won by the Zionist parties. And this was reflected throughout Poland. The Zionists were comprehensively rejected. But by using the death of Europe's Jews to legitimize its racist and apartheid state, Zionism demonstrates its utter contempt for those who died. Indeed, it defiles and it desecrates the memory of the 6 million. Quite literally, it spits on their grave because the Zionist leadership outside Europe did not lift a finger to help save the Jews under Nazi occupation. On the contrary, the Zionists opposed any rescue attempt to any destination which was not Palestine. And if I have time, I will come into it. And as Yehuda Alkana, the rector of the Central European University in Budapest, who Netanyahu's friend Viktor Orban threw out, said, when a false memory of the past participates in the political process, democracy itself is endangered. And I want to quote a critical Zionist historian, Noah Lucas, who described, I think, best the Zionist attitude to the Holocaust. This is in the Modern History of Israel, and this is actually quite a good book, and it's an honest book as well. And he wrote, as the European Holocaust erupted, Ben-Gurion, who was the first prime minister of Israel and shared the Jewish Agency, saw it as a decisive opportunity for Zionism. In conditions of peace, Zionism could not move the masses of world Jewry. The forces unleashed by Hitler, in all their horror, must be harnessed to the advantage of Zionism. By the end of 1942, the struggle for a Jewish state became the primary concern of the movement. And there is no doubt about this, that the Zionist movement held in 1942, April 1942, a conference at Biltmore, the Biltmore Conference in the United States. And it was the first call for the establishment of a Jewish state. Before then, the Zionists had hidden their actual goals. And Ben-Gurion's biographer, his official biographer, Shabtai Teva, wrote in his biography, The Burning Ground, quote, if there was a line in Ben-Gurion's mind between the beneficial disaster and an all-destroying catastrophe, it must have been a very fine one. And Shabtai Teva is more a hagiographer than a biographer, but even he had to realize that the attitude of Ben-Gurion and not just Ben-Gurion, but the whole of the Zionist leadership, was to utilize the Holocaust and exploit it to build their Jewish state. And when we had a Palestine Expo conference in London a few years ago, I described the Israeli state as the bastard fruit of Hitler. And there was a whole page article about my contribution in the Jewish Chronicle, because of course this outraged them. But it was true. Without Hitler, without the Nazis, it is doubtful whether there would have been established a Jewish state of Israel. And that is the sad fact of the matter. And Ben-Gurion was quite clear about this. He wrote, this was, if I give a little background, in 1938, November 1938, the Nazis instituted the first pogrom, the first major pogrom against the Jews of Germany, Kristallnacht. And over 100 were killed. Most synagogues were burnt to the ground, and 30,000 Jews were imprisoned in concentration camps. The Zionists amongst them were almost immediately released. And Britain offered, after pressure from the Board of Deputies, which wasn't then a Zionist body, incidentally, it was captured in 1940, they offered 10 places for 10,000 Jewish children in Britain. It was known as the Kindertransport. And you would imagine that the Zionists would have welcomed this, the survival of 10,000 Jewish children. But no, quite the opposite was the case. They were absolutely outraged because they said, if they're going to go anywhere, they go to Palestine. At that time, the British had given in to the Arab demand that Palestine should no longer be flooded with Jewish immigrants. And Ben-Gurion wrote, and this is really important, he wrote, he spoke to the Mapai, that's the Israeli Labour Party Central Committee, on the 9th of December 1938, that's just a month after Kristallnacht. If I knew, and I'm quoting, if I knew that it would be possible to save all the children in Germany by bringing them over to England, and only half of them by transporting them to Eretz Yisrael, then I would opt for the second alternative. For we must weigh not only the life of these children, but also the history of the people of Israel. And that really sums up the Zionist project. It was from the start a racial supremacist project above all. It was not and never was concerned about the fate of individual Jewry. In fact, throughout the Second World War, they wrote off the Jews of Europe. And Ben-Gurion, just a week later, in a memo to the Zionist executive of the 17th of December, he wrote, and he was worried, he wrote, if the Jews are faced with a choice between the refugee problem and rescuing Jews from concentration camps on the one hand, and aid for the National Museum in Palestine on the other, the Jewish sense of pity will prevail, and our people's entire strength will be directed at aid for the refugees in the various countries. Zionism will vanish from the agenda, and indeed not only world public opinion in England and America, but also from Jewish public opinion. And he warned, we are risking Zionism's very existence if we allow the refugee problem to be separated from the Palestine problem. And that was the Zionist worry, that they had to make sure that whenever the question of refugees and finding escape routes was raised, that immediately the cry went up, what about Palestine? But of course, we don't really hear about that now. And I want to share, if I can, the screen. Oh, right, you've disabled it, Esther. I don't know whether you can enable it again. If you can't, it doesn't matter, but it would be good if you could.
Yeah, I'll see if I can make you co-host. There you are.
Right, thank you. Let me have another go. Right, I want to share, and this is from, can everyone see it? This is from the Times of Israel today. And it's a headline, Israel's Holocaust survivors are hungry. Don't let us survive, and never again, don't let a survivor go hungry. I will have stopped the share now because you've all seen it. This is an indication of the real attitude of Israel today to the Holocaust and the Holocaust survivors. Israel spends the second greatest amount on weapons of any country in the world, and yet it can't afford to even keep the remaining Holocaust survivors free from want, free from poverty. They have a choice between eating and heating. And this is in a country where there is a high standard of living. It shows the utter contempt of the Israeli state for its surviving Holocaust survivors. The Holocaust to it is simply a political weapon to be wielded against its adversaries. And we shouldn't be surprised about this at all, because in 1953, it established the Holocaust Memorial Museum called Yad Vashem, which I call a Holocaust propaganda museum. And this museum, it has entertained its first fascist visitor was the Prime Minister of South Africa, John Vorster, in 1976, invited by the Israeli Labour government under Yitzhak Rabin. Since then, we've seen Viktor Orban, who described Admiral Horthy, that Stephen talked about, as an exceptional statesman, who presided over the deportation of nearly 500,000 Jews. Bolsonaro and Duterte, the presidents of Brazil and Philippines, who are open Hitler admirers. It is an institute which has fought and fought again against any universalization of the lessons of the Holocaust, because the Zionists are opposed to it, because they see the Holocaust as unique to the Jews. And I'll give an example of this. In 2018, Netanyahu decided that he wanted to get rid of the Black African refugees from Israel because they diluted the racial community. And Nir Gontas of Haaretz decided he would ring Yad Vashem to get them to speak out against this. And he described in Haaretz how, quote, one after the other of the senior staff there, including Mr. Avner Shalev, the director, slammed the phone down on me when I asked to speak to them. And this is indicative. Not once, never, ever has Yad Vashem spoken out against the racism that the Palestinians have experienced, despite the fact that Yad Vashem is really within a stone's throws of the village of Deir Yassin, where over 100 Palestinians were massacred in April 1948. And indeed, in 2009, Itamar Shapiro, a guide, pointed out to the visitors he was leading that Deir Yassin was, as I say, just a few hundred yards away. He was sacked on the spot. The reality is that the Zionists, in a sense, have really tried to transform the Holocaust from a Nazi occurrence to a Palestinian one. In 2015, Netanyahu addressed the World Zionist Congress, and he said that Hitler intended only to expel the Palestinians. It was the leader of the Palestinians, the Jews rather, sorry. It was a leader of the Palestinians, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, who convinced him to annihilate them. And we all know, and this was really an exoneration of the Nazis. And we all know that for Israel, every enemy is a new Hitler. Yasser Arafat, when Israel surrounded Beirut in 1982, was described by Menachem Begin as Hitler in his bunker. And there have been numerous references to the Palestinians and their leadership as the new Hitlers. Because what Zionism opposes above all is the universalization of the Holocaust. Because for us, the lessons to be learned from the Holocaust is that racism and fascism are something that always have to be combated, that refugees should be admitted. But for Israel, they draw exactly the opposite conclusion. Every year, thousands of Israeli school children are taken to Auschwitz. But what is the effect? It's to instill in them militarism and racism. And Gideon Levy, who is the famous Haaretz correspondent, he wrote, and I quote, "I have yet to hear a single teenager come back from Auschwitz and say that we mustn't abuse others the way we were abused. There has yet to be a school whose pupils came back from Birkenau straight to the Gaza border, saw the barbed wire fence and said never again. The message is always the opposite. Gaza is permitted because of Auschwitz." And that is the lesson that Zionism draws. And it was Edith Zertel, who's a professor of history, or was at the Hebrew University Jerusalem, in Israel's Holocaust, The Politics of Nationhood, who wrote, "The transference of the Holocaust situation onto the Middle East reality not only created a false sense of the imminent danger of mass destruction, because in every war Israel says it's facing an existential crisis, it also immensely distorted the image of the Holocaust, dwarfed the magnitude of the atrocities committed by the Nazis, trivializing the unique agony of the victims and the survivors, and utterly demonizing the Arabs and their leaders. This is how Israel treats the Holocaust." And in fact, Gerhard Riegner, for instance, who was a representative in Geneva during the war of the World Jewish Congress, wrote, "Auschwitz was not only a national memory belonging to the Jewish people, it was also an important political asset." And Peter Novick in The Holocaust in American Life wrote that use of the Holocaust to draw universal conclusions was a plunder of Jewish moral capital. By treating the Holocaust as unique, the Zionists promoted an evasion of moral and historical responsibility, because in comparison, everything is dwarfed. And it was Daniel Blackman, a Holocaust researcher at the Hebrew University, who said that the Holocaust serves the right's pro-fascist, racist, victim-centered discourse meant to whitewash the ongoing crimes against the Palestinians and to put the Christian world in a position of eternal apology.
Thank you, Tony. We all need to read your book, so
Can I?
say
Yes,
what you need to say.
Can I just finish with a couple of things? On the question of the Gypsies, we had a debate between Sybil Milton, the Holocaust historian at the United States Holocaust Museum, and Yehuda Bohr, who's the chief Zionist Holocaust historian. And Bohr wrote, the wandering gypsies were an irritant to the German mind, and in Nazi eyes, all social irritants were to be removed by murder, whereas Nazi ideology saw in the Jews a satanic force. The Jews were in Nazi eyes the enemy, whereas the gypsies were a marginal irritant. And the reason for that was quite simple. What he was arguing, that only the Jews and the Jews alone suffered a Holocaust. And Milton's response to that was withering. She said, defining an entire ethnic group as antisocial and criminal is a classic example of racism. I do not know why Mr. Bohr does not understand this. And I want to finish by just a quick reference to the present situation in Israel. Today, we've had elected a far-right Israeli regime, which contains Jewish Nazis. Let's be quite clear. Zavika Fogel, one of the Yehuda Otzmat representatives, was quoted as saying, if it is one Israeli mother crying or 1,000 Palestinian mothers crying, then 1,000 Palestinian mothers will cry. This is an echo of Rabbi Dov Lior, who is Ben Gavir's favorite rabbi. He's the chief rabbi, really, of the West Bank, who said a Jewish fingernail is worth more than 1,000 Arab lives. And he was outdone by Rabbi Yaakov Perrin, who gave the funeral eulogy to Baruch Goldstein, who murdered 29 Palestinian worshippers and many, many more he wounded in the Ibrahimi Mosque in Hebron. To Rabbi Yaakov Perrin, a Jewish fingernail was worth 1 million Palestinian lives. And this is the mentality of the leaders of the Israeli state today. They have indeed learnt the lessons of the Nazi Holocaust very well. But the lesson they have learnt is that if the Nazis could do it to the Jews, then we can also do it to other people. I'm not saying that the Zionists intend to exterminate the Palestinians, but what I am saying is the mentality that infused the Nazis is now present in the Zionist leadership of Israel. And so when they commemorate the Holocaust, you have to remember they commemorate it only to repeat many of the things that happened. Because do remember, the initial program of the Nazis was not extermination, it was expulsion of the Jews. It was only in 1941 with the invasion of Russia, Operation Barbarossa, that extermination became a reality. And of course, they miss out the disabled, because really the Holocaust began in October 1939, when 80,000 disabled Germans were exterminated, and throughout the war, possibly 500,000. So thank you very much. I do have a number of things to say, but buy my book, because all of this and much more is in it. And I should say, the first victims of the Nazis were not the Jews. The first victims of the Nazis were trade unionists and socialists and communists. The first concentration, Dachau, was opened not for Jews, but for socialists and communists and trade unionists. We should bear this in mind, because Zionism has rewritten the Holocaust today. Thank you very much.